Hi, my name is Dr. Elise Anderson. First, I would like to express my thanks to the staff of the U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion today. It's a real honor for me. And I would also like to say thanks to all of you out there in the ethers who are, listening and watching and taking notes perhaps along with me. I have been tasked with talking to you about Uyghur culture in particular and what the implications of what is happening in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region right now are for Uyghur culture. And so, as I've noted here on this title slide, I want to talk to you today about this topic of cultural destruction in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So let's jump right in. I've started out with a map here, and I know that you've already seen some maps and you already know where we're located and where we're talking about. But I just want to show yet another map with the Uyghur region highlighted in this orangey red color to remind us how far out in the Northwest we are, right? The geographical ways that this particular region is distinct. I'll also show you a second map, believe it or not, and one that at first glance to most of you is probably going to look a little bit confusing, but that's actually part of my point. I love this map because, so what you're seeing here is that the Uyghur region, which is also known by Xinjiang, is centered, right, and becomes the focus and the object of this map. And you can see the compilers of the map have used different languages, different scripts, different place name conventions to kind of show you some of the diversity of this place, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting. You can also see in greater relief just how many borders it shares with the rest of China proper: Tibet, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia. Right, this starts to get at the crossroads nature and crossroads history of this region, and also the tremendous cultural and other diversity that is found there. And those ideas about cultural distinction from the mainstream in China really underpin a lot of the ways that it's productive to think about this place. So I just want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page with some terms here. And so I've titled, this introductory section, Culture Matters in the PRC, by which I mean to say culture is important politically, culturally, and otherwise in the People's Republic of China. So culture, of course, is a very broad term that can refer to a lot of different things. And that's the case in a lot of different languages, right? It can encompass different realms, including customs and habits, music and other arts, foodways, and religion. I'll talk to you specifically about music today because that's my specialty, but know that when I'm talking about culture, I'm not getting necessarily super specific or theoretical, but I'm embracing the kind of wide way that we tend to think of that word and what it means. Now, the state in China has done a lot to define culture ever since the establishment of the PRC in 1949, right? The government has taken culture very seriously. And in fact, as I've noted here, culture was very central to the project of ethnic classification, especially as it was carried out in the 1940s and the 1950s. There are ways that people understand, and this is going to become, the importance of this is going to become clear as I continue talking, but there are ways that people understand the relationship, for example, between culture and religion that are those things being closely interwound with one another. And so that happens both in terms of indigenous understandings of Uyghur culture, right? So the way that Uyghurs understand Uyghur culture, but also state or kind of outside definitions of Uyghur culture in China. And that point has really important implications for what's happening right now. Islam, Uyghurs practice Islam, as you already know, and Islam is not a sole defining factor of Uyghur life. And in fact, not all Uyghurs are Muslim. Not all Uyghurs practice the religion, but Islam still inflects the culture in many different ways. And so one of those good examples, as you're going to see, is Uyghur music, which is my own research specialty. I also, as we're getting started, wanted to just give yet another broad overview of what is happening right now. So, China has this campaign of repression that it's carrying out in the Uyghur region against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic and or Muslim peoples. And that campaign is comprised of many different things. So, one is this pervasive Orwellian-style surveillance state that fundamentally means that there's very little that's private. And a whole lot of people are living in fear right now because they know that they're being monitored through technological, and also human means of surveillance. Indigenous peoples of the region are disappearing or being disappeared en masse. We know that there's detention, there's internment into a camp system, and there are very rapidly growing rates of incarceration in the prison system among Uyghur, Kazakh, and other populations. The authorities are placing indigenous peoples into forced labor schemes, and that's happening inside the Uyghur region. It's also happening throughout the rest of China. This is all well documented, by the way, in open source reporting. The state is destroying the family unit through policies that promote parent-child separation and also state child care, which is coming in the form of boarding schools for toddlers and infants, as well as through an infrastructural sort of buildup of the orphanage system. Normal religious practice has been criminalized and recast as suspicious. So the Quran, for example, is considered a terrorist text. And in total, these above policies, these above components of this campaign of repression constitute what scholars and observers have been saying for years now is cultural genocide, or the systematic destruction of certain cultural activities, cultural artifacts, cultural rights, I think we could add as well. Cultural genocide is like the word culture, it's a broad and wide term. It's used in a lot of different ways. Some people will contest it, but I'd be happy to answer some more questions about it in the Q&A if you have them. But just know that many people, myself included, are looking at what's happening and saying, this is cultural genocide. This is cultural destruction on a systematic and large scale. And just, as one quick example of normal religious and cultural practice being cast as suspicious as part of this campaign of repression, right? In February, there was a very high profile leak known as the Qaraqash document or Qaraqash list, which was a spreadsheet that contained really detailed information about a number of detainees from a particular county in the Uyghur region. And, one of the things that this spreadsheet included was a lot of information on just kind of normal things that people do in their lives, like pray before a meal, or pray after a meal, or celebrate holidays, right? These are just normal things that even a non-practicing Muslim or practicing Muslim, people all across the spectrum of religious belief or unbelief might do. But this document showed us that those things were worthy of recording in the authorities' minds and worthy of using as grounds for suspiciousness. And so what I want you to do is imagine how it would impact the texture of your everyday life for the authorities to see virtually everything you do as suspicious, right? If the sum total of activities in your life can be thought of as some manifestation of the culture in which you live and the culture in which you grow up, imagine what it means for so many things that you would want to do to be suspicious and to be grounds for you to be taken away. And also imagine how a situation like this would impact your ability, thus, to freely practice your culture or your traditions and to simply live your life, right? You're just trying to be yourself and get by every day, but it's very difficult in a context like this one. And so I would say that in some, I think the sense that I hope you're getting, if you haven't already, is that life for Uyghurs and others looks, feels, and sounds more different in 2020 than I think it ever has in recent history. What's happening now didn't come out of nowhere, but it is so pervasive and so big. I think, there are these ways that life is just so significantly different for Uyghurs right now, and what's at stake in this, right, is the right to live dignified, human lives in which people can look to their own indigenous history, indigenous knowledge, indigenous customs, indigenous music, and so forth. So I have a few pictures that just show a little bit about, religious life in the region. And I'm going to use that to segue into talking about music as a manifestation of culture. So this is the Eidgah Mosque in Kashgar, one of the largest mosques in China, one of the most famous mosques for Uyghurs, and religiously and culturally significant. This was a photo I took in 2007 of people leaving the mosque after Friday prayers. Here are a few pictures from inside the mosque. Another photo from 2007, veiling, and this particular style of veiling was, this particular style of veiling was very popular, very widespread among older women in Kashgar at the time, although it's completely disappeared now. Those were all images from 2007. Here are a couple of images from 2011. I traveled to a shrine where Uyghur pilgrims were making pilgrimage, and where every May for years and years there had been a festival that would happen outside this particular shrine. And so I'm bringing these up not to claim, again, I said, Islam is not the sole defining factor of culture. It's not even something that every Uyghur practices, but in many ways, right, it inflects a lot of cultural practices that Uyghurs do have. And so, this includes that. And in this particular photo, an epic poetry reciter was performing a religious epic poem outside a shrine in Khudden. Here's a picture from inside the shrine. Pilgrims very kindly took me under their wing, kind of walked me through what I needed to do to go in the shrine, allowed me to be inside the shrine, observing, taking photos, and so forth. Right, but this is one element of Uyghur religious and cultural life. And finally, here we are now at music, as a manifestation of culture and as a place where you can see some of these inflections of religion and religious tradition into kind of contemporary cultural practices that don't necessarily seem to have all that much to do with a religion. So what I want to talk to you about, the example that I want to use today is called Muqam, which is a form of, people often refer to it as classical Uyghur music, and it has a lot of roots in religious practice, historically speaking. The image that I've placed here is simply called Muqam. It's from 1983, and it was painted by Ghazi Ahmed, who was a very famous, beloved in many senses, and state-supported Uyghur painter. All right, this is an iconic image. If you ever visit a Uyghur restaurant anywhere in the world, it will very likely have this image somewhere on the walls inside that restaurant. All right, so I have prepared a slide with some lyrics from the introductory section to one Muqam suite. And before I talk to you a lot about what Muqam is, I just want you to listen to a little bit of it, and you can follow along here if you are so interested.
Misali hecden nalan törerme Törermen canı sanlar Bana yarab nesbetsin Ne bolgayı gül ozan
All right, so it's just tiny, tiny bit of what happens in a Muqam suite. So what is Muqam? Quickly, it is 12 suites, each organized into 3 different sections, and that in total, a single suite can last up to 2 hours, right? So this is kind of a very large scale, almost encyclopedic form of music. Its melodies build up to what is called an evj, or a climactic point. So there are ways in which the kind of melodic shape, right, of Muqam is always building up, and then it comes back down, and then it builds up again and comes back down. And melody actually is, for those of you who are musically inclined, have some knowledge about music, melody is far more important in Muqam and far more important in most of Uyghur music than harmony is. In fact, there's very little harmony ever. Most of the music is very melodically focused. And part of why that is has to do with the aesthetics and the things that are most aesthetically central and aesthetically important to Uyghur music. One of those is called mung, which is a sense of sorrowfulness. And the other, arguably more important, is something that's called purak, which is, it literally means scent, but it's akin to something like flavor. All the things that make the little turns and ornamentations as the melody rises, that make a melody, you know, beautiful and technically masterful and correct. The texts, the lyrics of Muqam, right? So it's not just instrumental music, it's not just singing, it's both. It also has dance involved in it. And the lyrics of Muqam include a lot of symbols and images of what I've labeled as the religious. So when you read between the lines of them, right, and you know a little bit about the history, you can understand that the lyrics have a lot to do with the separation between humankind and Allah. So there's this creator, Allah is invisible and far away, and we as humankind, we are unable to see that. We are veiled. There are symbols of veiling all over the lyrics of Muqam, and it really has to do with this. A lot of people will interpret them as having to do with romantic love, and it's possible that that meaning is there too, you know, if for no other reason than because that's how people understand it. But looking back in the religious and musical history, it really has a lot to do with this, with the separation between humankind and the creator. So I've already made hints at this. In addition to, you know, having these religious roots, Muqam is also a very culturally significant contemporary symbol. And part of the reason for that is that it has been the object of decades of culture work in the PRC. And some of the effects of those decades of culture work include that, you know, some of the religious meanings of the music have kind of changed or have fallen away in the way that people understand Muqam. Now, in 2005, after so many decades of culture work in the PRC on Muqam, Muqam actually received status as intangible cultural heritage from UNESCO. You know, remarkably, it was the very first thing that China had inscribed on a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. But since 2017, the transmission and performance of Muqam have been curtailed very heavily. And why 2017? That was when this current campaign of cultural repression really amped up and really just started to take off, right? So what we've been seeing ever since 2017 is that these previous decades in which the state put massive amounts of financial and human capital into work on Muqam and other Uyghur music and culture. Since 2017, they've gone back on that. And they've actually been destroying some of the institutions that they helped to build up over the decades. So a few, video and other examples of Muqam. Actually, I'll just skip over playing this video in the interest of time. But this is a short video clip of an excerpt from a Muqam stage show that I saw performed live at the Xinjiang Muqam Ensemble in February 2013. And this speaks to the way that, there actually is an ensemble that is tasked with, the public performance of this Muqam tradition based out of the center of Urumqi. And as you can see, they spared no expense on the stage, the set, the costuming. You can see dancers, vocalists, instrumentalists here. This is very much a spectacular form of music in the way it's staged. So, excuse me. Another example of the state work and the state interest in Muqam comes from this 1995 publication of a facsimile of a manuscript dated back to the middle of the 19th century. It's called the Tawarikh Musikiyun, or the History of Musicians. And it's basically the only local written source we know of that contains some information about the history of this tradition. But, it's something that the state very actively and enthusiastically supported. In the 1950s, the government brought a musician from the southern part of the Uyghur region to Urumqi, the regional capital, so that they could record the Muqam and begin working on audio recordings and written scores based off of his performance to help make Muqam into a canon. A more contemporary example comes from Yarkent County, which is Yarkent is historically considered a very important kind of the birthplace and the home of Muqam. Today, the main square of Yarkent is not named People's Square, as main squares in many Chinese municipalities are. Instead, it's the Muqam Square. And as you can see on this screen, it has a treble clef kind of carved into it with a dutar, which is a Uyghur instrument, running down the middle of that treble clef as the backbone. And I include it here to show, right, this is part of the decades of culture work I'm talking about. The support that the authorities in China, the Chinese government, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region government, put a lot of work into what they said was preserving and promoting Muqam as an index of how much they cared about it and how much they supported it. So much so, they kind of emblazoned the built environment with a symbol of it. Another index of, just the status of Muqam as a cultural symbol, right? Something with religious roots became this very contemporary cultural symbol. These are frame drums in this photo, but you can see images from that Muqam painting I showed you several slides ago. They're kind of pulled out of that Muqam painting and recreated here on the faces of instruments. Here's the same image woven into a carpet for sale at a bazaar in Kashgar. This was back in 2007. Like I already said, this image is on the walls of Uyghur restaurants all over the world, and you'll find it in a lot of places. It's so iconic, and it shows us a lot about how this became a symbol. But, I've already hinted at the fact that we're seeing Muqam curtailed. And there are a lot of ways in which the Muqam world, this professional musical world, or just a musical world, has become very silent. And what it looks like to those of us who are observing from the outside is that the state finds something terrifying about Muqam. And I think more to the point, the state seems to find something troublesome in Uyghur cultural and religious practice in general. What are those things that are so terrifying? I think it's that they signal a distinct worldview, trust in an authority other than the Chinese Communist Party, right? So that might have to do with, you know, trust in a creator, trust in Allah, right? There's this creator that I can't see, but I want to see. That's why I'm singing about my creator through the Muqam. I'm doing that in the first place because I have a distinct worldview, something that's a little different from the mainstream, something that looks more towards Central Asia and the Muslim world. Right, and as I jumped the gun, I got ahead of myself, you know, but these things articulate a difference from the mainstream in both religious and cultural terms. And thus, I think that it might be an overstatement to say that, you know, the Chinese government thinks that Muqam is an existential threat. I might not go that far, but I would say that the distinct worldview articulated by Muqam and the fact that it helps people to reflect on, right, a different kind of authority, that it helps them to articulate identity and the way they relate to, you know, this group of people that is different. Those things together signal a very real existential threat that calls into question, you know, the legitimacy of governance, the legitimacy of rule, and so forth. And so that's what I think is at stake here, right? That's what's going on with Muqam. That's why something like Muqam, as a specific example, and Uyghur music and Uyghur culture more broadly, that's what's at stake for them. And so I've already made several references, right, to what seems to be happening as we look in from the outside, because that's, those of us who are outside, this is all we can do, is try to know, you know, as best we can what it's possible to know. And so for a very long time, Muqam was at the center of a project of developing Uyghur culture and a project of working on Uyghur culture, but that's really changed since 2017. The party has moved from promoting the sound of Muqam to creating silence, right? And this goes back to those points about cultural destruction and cultural genocide. So the Muqam ensemble that I showed you a picture of, they rarely perform anymore. Recently, there were some photos of a conference that happened at the Muqam ensemble in April of 2020. That appears to have been a one-off sort of event. For years now, there has been absolutely no news about what this ensemble has been up to. Back in 2018, Muqam programs at the Xinjiang Arts Institute were eliminated and replaced with a major in folk song and new elective courses in Beijing opera. It's not bad to study folk song. It's not bad to learn Beijing opera. There's nothing inherently awful about those things, but the fact that they're being brought into the space that is made by taking Muqam away, right, speaks to some of this destruction and genocide. And another way that silence is manifesting is in the fact that the Chinese state has disappeared a number of Uyghur musicians and others, so researchers, culture workers, and so forth, who've played an important role in researching, promoting, and passing on cultural and musical knowledge, right? And these things in sum total point to these policies of destruction, policies of cultural genocide. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you in a really short amount of time. I've used a number of different terms and concepts, but I really appreciate your attention, and I hope to hear some questions from you in the Q&A. Thanks.